1,641 points. That is where Joe Sakic finished, 8th on the all-time scoring list in the entire history of the National Hockey League. Ahead of him, only names carved into stone: Gretzky, Howe, Lemieux, Messier. Below him, everyone else who ever laced up a skate. 625 goals, 1,016 assists, 20 seasons, 1 franchise. 2 Stanley Cups as a player, and a third 1 year later wearing a suit instead of a sweater. Now sit with this one. 8 overtime goals in the playoffs. 8. More than any human being who has ever played the sport. When the lights were brightest, when one shot ended everything, the puck found his stick, and the building went silent. And then it didn't. Here is the stat that should stop you cold. In the spring of 1996, Sakic scored 18 goals in a single playoff run, 1 short of the all-time record, and 6 of them were game winners. 6. That shattered a record that had stood for decades. A man who barely spoke, who reporters nicknamed Quoteless Joe because he refused to talk about himself, quietly walked into the postseason and dismantled the record book and the wrist shot. Ask any goaltender who faced him. They will tell you the same thing. It was released before they could move, fired from anywhere inside the blue line, and it was already past them by the time their glove twitched. Bleacher Report called it the greatest wrist shot in the history of hockey and said there was no debate. A quiet kid from Burnaby who didn't speak English until kindergarten became one of the deadliest scorers the game has ever seen. So how good was Joe Sakic actually? He was not supposed to be this. There was no blueprint, no hockey bloodline, no family fortune funneling a prodigy toward greatness. Joe Sakic was born in 1969 to 2 Croatian immigrants. His father, Marigan, came from Imotski. His mother, Slavica, came from Lika. They crossed an ocean separately, met in Canada, married, and started a family in the working-class suburbs of Vancouver. Marijan was a stonemason. He laid rock for a living, the kind of labor that breaks the body slowly. And he did it so his children could have a life he never had. When little Joe started school, he barely spoke a word of English. The few words he knew came out in Croatian. He was the quiet boy in the corner, the one who watched more than he talked, and that silence would follow him for the rest of his life. Decades later, reporters would mock his refusal to brag. They didn't understand. The silence was always there. It was who he was. But hockey spoke a language he understood. At 4 years old, his parents took him to his first NHL game, the Vancouver Canucks against the Atlanta Flames. He sat in the stands, watched grown men fly across the ice, and something locked into place. He decided right there that he would do this, that he would become a hockey player. Marijan, the stonemason, built a rink in the backyard so his son could skate. And when money was tight, the family still scraped together $300 for a membership at the North Shore Club so Joe's sister could figure skate. The deal threw in ice time for the boys. So Joe skated and skated and skated. Here is the problem nobody saw coming. He was small, always small. By his teenage years, he would top out at 5'11", $195, with no overwhelming size, no terrifying physique, nothing that made a scout's pen move on its own. In a sport that worshipped power and brutality, Sakic was a slight, soft-spoken kid who looked like he might get crushed against the boards. So he did the only thing he could. He turned skill into a weapon. He picked an idol, Wayne Gretzky, the smartest man to ever play the game, and he studied him. He learned to think the game too moves ahead. And every single day, he stood in front of a net and fired pucks. Hours of it. From every angle, every distance, over and over, until the motion lived in his wrists and not his brain. He was building the shot that would one day terrify the best goalies on earth. And nobody was watching. The Western Hockey League is where Canadian boys go to find out if they are real. For Sakic, it was the Swift Current Broncos, a team in the smallest city in the entire league, out on the frozen flatlands of Saskatchewan. He arrived for the 1986 season and immediately proved he belonged. As a rookie, on the youngest team in the league, he scored 60 goals. 60. He was already the third leading scorer in the entire WHL. A 17-year-old kid making veterans look slow. And then the next year he detonated. 78 goals, 82 assists, 160 points in a single junior season, tying Théophile Fleury for the WHL scoring title. He was named the league's most valuable player and the Canadian Major Junior Player of the Year. He captured a gold medal with Team Canada at the World Junior Championships. Suddenly, people were whispering the most dangerous comparison in hockey. The next Gretzky. So the scouts came. And here is the thing that should embarrass an entire generation of them. When the 1987 draft arrived, 14 names came off the board before Sakic. 14. The Quebec Nordiques finally grabbed him at 15th overall, and they only had that pick because they'd traded away Dale Hunter and Clint Malachuk to Washington to get it. 293 points in his last 2 junior seasons, and still 14 teams looked at the small, quiet kid and passed. They saw the size. They didn't see the wrists. Even after Quebec drafted him, Sakic did something almost no prospect does. He told the Nordiques he wanted to stay in junior another year. He wanted to add muscle. He wanted to be ready. He wanted, though he'd never say it out loud, to stay with a team that had just been through hell. But we will get to that, because that is the part of this story that changed who he was forever. The point is this. The kid who would finish 8th in the history of the sport was the 15th pick in his own draft class. The doubt was real. The doubt was everywhere. And he was about to spend the next 7 years living inside it. October 6th, 1988, Hartford. Joe Sakic plays his first NHL game and picks up an assist in a 6-2 Nordiques win. 2 days later, he scores his first goal, beating goaltender Sean Burke of the New Jersey Devils. There was a small, telling detail. His number, 19, the number that would one day hang from the rafters, was already taken by a teammate, so Sakic wore 88 that first season. The legend started in someone else's leftover digits. He was a front-runner for Rookie of the Year before an ankle injury knocked him out for 10 games and stalled his scoring. But the talent was undeniable. 62 points in 70 games as a rookie. Then he kicked the door off its hinges. 102 points, 109. Then 94, 105, 94. Year after year, this slight kid from Burnaby was putting up triple-digit seasons and ripping that wrist shot past the best in the world. There was just one catastrophic problem. The Quebec Nordiques were terrible, not bad. Historically, miserably terrible. In 5 of Sakic's first 7 seasons, they finished last in their division. For 3 straight years, they finished dead last in the entire National Hockey League. Worst team in the sport. Picture it. One of the most gifted offensive players alive, scoring more than a point a game, putting on a clinic every night, and going home a loser. The points were beautiful. The losing was suffocating. And the critics found their angle fast. Sure, Sakic could fill a net, but could he win? Was he just a stat padder on a bad team? A pretty scorer with no spine for the postseason? That was the wall. Individual brilliance trapped inside collective failure. And then came the moment that revealed what was actually underneath all that silence. The Nordiques held the rights to Eric Lindros, the most hyped prospect in a generation, a man who refused to sign and play for them. The franchise was paralyzed, clinging to a player who didn't want them. And it was Sakic, the quiet one, who suggested the unthinkable. That maybe the team could move forward without Lindros, that they didn't need to wait for someone else to save them. Lindros was traded the next year, and the haul that came back rebuilt the roster from the studs up. The quiet kid had just made the loudest decision in franchise history, and almost nobody noticed who'd pushed for it. For 7 years, Joe Sakic was a great player on a bad team. Then everything changed in a single summer. In May of 1995, the Nordiques were sold. The franchise was ripped out of Quebec City and dropped into Denver, Colorado. They got a new name, the Colorado Avalanche, new colors, a new arena, and a clean slate. Sakic, who'd been named captain back in 1992, was introduced as the leader of a team that didn't even have a finished name yet, and the roster that had been quietly assembled around him was no longer a punchline. It was a juggernaut. The Lindros trade had brought in a young Swedish wizard named Peter Forsberg. Mid-season, the team would pull off the trade that lit the fuse on a dynasty, acquiring Patrick Roy, the greatest big-game goaltender of his era, fresh off a meltdown in Montreal. Suddenly, the man who'd spent 7 years carrying corpses had a real team around him. But the change wasn't only in the roster. It was in Sakic himself. The pure scorer was becoming a complete winner. He was still putting the puck in the net at a frightening rate, but now he was driving a team, setting a tone, leading the way he'd always led. Not with speeches, with example. Show up first. Work the hardest. Say almost nothing. Let the work say it for you. Ray Bourque, who would later play with him, put it perfectly. When something needed to be said, Joe said it. He just didn't need to say very much. In that first season in Denver, the mask of great stats, no wins, finally came off. Sakic poured in 120 points in 82 games. The Avalanche didn't just make the playoffs. They were a freight train. And the man who'd been criticized for never winning anything was about to author one of the most dominant individual postseasons the sport has ever seen. The breakthrough was here. 7 years of doubt, 7 years of finishing last, 7 years of being the pretty scorer who couldn't win. All of it was about to be answered in the span of 2 unforgettable months. The 1996 playoffs are where Joe Sakic stopped being a question and became an answer. The first round brought the Vancouver Canucks. And a personal homecoming, because this was Sakic's backyard, the region where they would one day name a street Joe Sakic Way. He responded by tying a franchise record with 7 goals in a single series. But Game 5 is the one that lives forever. Sakic and Vancouver's Trevor Linden traded hat tricks in the same game. Only the 4th time in the entire history of the Stanley Cup playoffs that 2 players completed hat tricks against each other. With under 6 minutes left, Colorado trailing, Sakic tied the score. Then, in overtime, he scored again to complete the hat trick and win the game. It was the first playoff overtime goal of his career. It would not be the last, not even close. The second roundabout delivered the Chicago Blackhawks, and with them, the longest night in franchise history. Game 4 went to a triple overtime, the first triple overtime game the franchise had ever played. The minutes piled up. Players cramped and gasped on the bench. And then, in the third extra period, with everyone in the building emotionally wrecked, Joe Sakic ended it. The quiet man, again with the game on his stick. Then came the villain. The defending champions, the Detroit Red Wings. A 62-win machine, the most loaded, most feared roster in hockey. A team built to win 3 cups in a row. Standing between Colorado and the final was the closest thing the sport had to an unbeatable empire. Steve Yzerman, Sergei Fedorov, a defense that smothered you, a franchise that expected to win. The Avalanche beat them in 6. And in that series, the rivalry that would define an entire decade of hockey was born, a blood feud between Colorado and Detroit that would spill into brawls and goalie fights for years. But in 1996, round 1 of that war, it was Sakic and the Avalanche who walked away. He put up 2 more game winners against the champions. The empire fell, which left the Florida Panthers and the Stanley Cup final. And what happened next was less a series than an execution. Sakic scored the go-ahead goal in Game 3 to put Colorado up 3-0, a strike that came 82 seconds after a teammate had tied it. The Avalanche outscored Florida 15-4 across the series. And then came Game 4, one of the greatest goaltending duels ever played. Patrick Roy and Florida's John Vanbiesbrouck went save for save into the night. Regulation, scoreless. First overtime, scoreless. Second overtime, scoreless. The teams set a record for the longest scoreless stretch in Stanley Cup final history. Finally, Deep in the third overtime, after 44 minutes and 31 seconds of sudden death, Uwe Krupp's shot found the net. 1-0. A sweep. Roy had stopped all 63 shots he faced that night, and 147 of 151 in the series. It was the first major professional sports championship in the history of Denver, and the man holding the Conn Smythe Trophy as the MVP of the entire playoffs was Joe Sakic. 18 goals, one shy of the all-time record, 6 game-winning goals, a new record that shattered the old one, 34 points in 22 games, with at least 1 point in 19 of them. A game winner in every single round. The pretty scorer who couldn't win had just delivered the most clutch postseason of his generation. But none of that mattered to Sakic the way the second one would. The years between were cruel. A lacerated calf cost him most of the next season, though the Avalanche still won their first President's Trophy. A knee injury at the 1998 Olympics wiped out more games. There was the summer of 1997, when the New York Rangers tried to steal him with a 3-year, $21 million offer sheet built around a $15 million signing bonus, a poison pill designed to be impossible to match. The Avalanche had 7 days to match it or lose Sakic for 5 first-round picks. And the thing that saved them was almost too absurd to be true. The team's owners also produced movies. That summer, their blockbuster, Air Force One, starring Harrison Ford, made a fortune. The profits gave Colorado just enough money to match the offer. A Harrison Ford action film is the only reason Joe Sakic stayed an Avalanche. He never played a single shift for the Rangers. In 1999, Colorado came within 1 game of the final, before falling to the eventual champion Dallas Stars. The hunger gnawed, and then came the season that answered everything. 2001. Sakic, now 31, played the best hockey of his life. A career-high 54 goals, 118 points, both second best in the entire league. He won the Hart Trophy as league MVP. He won the Lady Byng for sportsmanship. He won the Lester B. Pearson, the award voted on by the players themselves, handed to him, fittingly, by his old Nordiques mentor Peter Stastny. He was even a finalist for the Selk as a defensive forward. One man, sweeping the awards table. But the season had a deeper mission. Years earlier, the Avalanche had traded for Ray Bourque, one of the greatest defensemen who ever lived. A man who had played 22 seasons and never won a Stanley Cup. 2 decades of brilliance with nothing to show for it. The whole team adopted his quest. They called it Mission 16W. The 16 wins it takes to win the cup for the man wearing number 77. It came down to a Game 7 against the defending champion New Jersey Devils. Colorado won 3-1. And then came the single most beautiful act of Joe Sakic's career. Maybe the most selfless image in the history of the sport. Gary Bettman handed the Stanley Cup to Sakic, the captain. By every tradition in hockey, the captain skates the first lap. The captain hoists it first. It is his right, earned over a career. Sakic raised it for barely a heartbeat. Then he turned and he handed it straight to Ray Bourque, so that the man who had waited 22 years could be the first to lift it over his head. Sakic stepped back and applauded. The quiet man gave away his own greatest moment, and in doing so created one that no one who saw it has ever forgotten. 2 cups, 1 Conn Smythe, 1 heart, and a single, wordless gesture that told you everything about who Joe Sakic was. To understand the man who handed away the Stanley Cup, you have to go back to a highway in Saskatchewan, to the thing he refused to speak about for almost his entire life. December 30th, 1986. Sakic was 17. The Swift Current Broncos boarded their old Western Flyer bus, bound for a game in Regina 2.5 hours away. The weather was turning. Cold dropping toward freezing, wind picking up. Just outside town, on the very first curve heading east, the bus hit a patch of black ice on an overpass. It slid. The driver fought a steering wheel that wouldn't answer. The bus went off the road, hit an embankment, went airborne, and flipped onto its side, sliding to rest in a ditch. 4 of Sakic's teammates were sitting in the very back, playing cards. Trent Kress, Scott Kruger, Chris Mantica, Brent Ruff. All four were killed. The kid named Ruff was just 16 years old. Joe Sakic was unhurt. He climbed out through the broken front window of the bus into the snow. He was 17, in his stocking feet, standing in a frozen field while the people he played beside lay dead a few yards away. A teammate later described the silence afterward, that it was eerily deaf, no sound at all, everything in slow motion. The team voted to keep playing. They wore a patch for the fallen. They turned down counselling. And in that wreckage, something hardened in the quiet boy from Burnaby. He became the leader. Not by talking, he would barely talk about that day for the rest of his life, but by showing up, by finishing the season, by scoring those 60 goals and dragging a shattered team into the playoffs. He once admitted the crash made him more careful, more cautious, more deliberate about everything he did. 21 years later, after another junior team suffered its own tragedy, Sakic finally broke his silence, only because he hoped it might help someone else heal. He could still recall the exact weather that day, the temperature, the wind, the radio warnings. "You never do forget," he said. "They say time heals, and it does, but you remember everything. You never forget." That is the man who gave away the cup. The silence everyone mocked wasn't arrogance. It was a 17-year-old who walked out of a bus that killed 4 of his friends and decided that the loud part of life wasn't worth very much. The work was. The people were. Everything else was noise. Greatness doesn't get to leave on its own terms. The body does. After the second cup, Sakic kept producing at a level most players never reach. The Avalanche reached the conference final, again in 2002, falling to Detroit. There were down years. A 58-point season that ranked as his lowest, but he always had, bouncing back to finish third in league scoring at 87 points. He stacked milestones like firewood. 1,000 points, 1,500 points, joining a club of only Howe, Gretzky, Lemieux, Bourque, and Yzerman to do it with a single franchise. 1,600 points, 1,000 assists, just the 11th player in history. Then came the proof of just how long the engine ran. In 2007, at 37 years old, Joe Sakic scored 100 points in a season. At 37. That made him the second oldest player in NHL history to hit triple digits, behind only Gordie Howe. A streak of 232 consecutive games played finally ended only when a hernia required surgery. But the injuries were closing in. A herniated disc in his back, the wear of 2 decades. And in 2009, after 20 seasons, 1 franchise, and almost every scoring record that franchise had, Joe Sakic announced his retirement. 625 goals, 1,016 assists, 1,641 points, 8th on the all-time list, 14th in goals. Before the next season's opener, the Avalanche raised number 19. The number a teammate once kept him from wearing, into the rafters, where it will hang forever. The quiet man walked off exactly as he'd walked on. No noise, just the work, finished. Trace the whole arc and it almost doesn't seem real. A boy who couldn't speak English, the son of a Croatian stonemason, skating on a backyard rink his father built by hand. A 17-year-old who survived a bus crash that killed 4 of his friends and learned, far too young, exactly what silence costs and what it protects. A 15th overall pick that 14 teams passed on. 7 years of finishing last, branded a scorer who couldn't win. And then, in one franchise across 2 cities, the transformation into a 2-time champion, a playoff overtime king, the owner of the most feared wrist shot in the history of the game, and the man who handed away his own greatest trophy so another man could feel what he felt. The nickname stuck, Quoteless Joe, and he wore it with a smile, even repeating it himself. But the silence was never emptiness. It was the most consistent thing in hockey. He led the Nordics and Avalanche franchise as captain for 15 straight seasons. He joined the Triple Gold Club. A Stanley Cup, a World Championship gold, and an Olympic gold at the 2002 Salt Lake City Games, where he scored the winner set-up goals against the United States, took home the tournament MVP, and ended a 50-year drought of Canadian Olympic hockey gold. And the story didn't even stop when he stopped playing. Years later, as general manager of the Avalanche, Sakic built another champion from the ground up and won the Stanley Cup, again in 2022, making him only the third person ever to win a cup with the same franchise as both a player and a general manager. The quiet kid didn't just become a legend. He became the architect of the next one. So where does he stand among the immortals? Be fair about it. Wayne Gretzky is the greatest scorer who ever lived, untouchable, the standard by which everyone is measured. Mario Lemieux may have been the most physically gifted player in history. Steve Yzerman captained Detroit through a dynasty and matched Sakic's quiet leadership crown. Marc Messier was the loudest, most ferocious winner of his time. Set against those names, Sakic was not the most dominant scorer, and he'd be the first to say so, if he said anything at all. But here is where the case turns. When the game was tied and the season hung on single shift, history says give the puck to Sakic. 8 playoff overtime goals, more than any of them, more than anyone, ever. 6 game winners in one postseason, a record, a Conn Smythe, a Hart, an Olympic MVP, a place in the triple gold club that even Gretzky and Lemieux never reached. He is one of only 4 players in history to captain his team to a Stanley Cup and win the league MVP in the very same year, standing alongside Bobby Clarke, Gretzky, and Messier. And then he did the thing none of them did. He won a cup as a player and built one as a manager. The verdict is this: Joe Sakic was not the single greatest hockey player who ever lived, but he is, without serious challenge, one of the greatest leaders and one of the greatest clutch performers the sport has ever produced. A top 10 all-time scorer who saved his best for the moments that decided everything, and who did it all without ever once asking for the credit. The doubters who passed on him 14 times in 1987 got the answer they deserved. Burnaby Joe was that good. He arrived in someone else's number, survived a tragedy he'd carry forever in silence, and left the game holding everything except the spotlight he kept handing to other people. That is the strange, beautiful truth of Joe Sakic, the loudest legacy in hockey, built entirely without noise. Next time, we're heading into the war that defined the next decade of the sport. The brawls, the goalie fight, the blood feud between Colorado and Detroit. You won't want to miss it.